Welcome, guys, to episode 14 of the Produce Common Sense podcast. I always have really cool people with me, and they don't always know that they're going to be on the podcast. But I'm glad that I've got the group from ABIC here with me, and they're going to be defining all. In fact, we're going to be talking about all kinds of acronyms, everything surrounding agriculture. As we talked about what we could converse about today, we decided that the appropriate name for this was a candid conversation about immigration. If you followed me for very long, if you followed my content, you have seen how maybe I can get, I don't think it's fair to say overly passionate about immigration, but I definitely get very passionate and like to convey my perspective about these circumstances in which so many immigrant workers are in. Those who have been here for a few years, those who come on a temporary visa, those who have been here for most of their life. And in a lot of ways, these folks, we don't understand them. And we don't understand them because we maybe don't work with them. We don't know them personally. We don't know anyone like them. And the hope of today's conversation is to get you a little bit behind the scenes and have you see a little bit more eye to eye what these folks are doing, why they matter, and why we need to pay more attention to them, both from a humanitarian standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and from everything else. So today I would like to introduce James O'Neill. James and I met, probably getting close to a year ago now. Michael DeHeger and Enrique Sanchez. These guys are all with, like I said, ABIC. And who wants to start, first of all, by defining what ABIC is and what your mission is?
Sure, I can speak to that. How's this? Is this okay? So ABIC is the American Business Immigration Coalition. We are a national bipartisan coalition of around 1,200 CEOs, small business owners, trade associations in about 17 states that is advocating for common sense immigration solutions that allow immigrants who are here in the country to contribute to the economy, fully participate in their communities, and address the labor shortage that we're seeing across really every industry. Our members we have members from ag, like yourself. We have folks from the hospitality industry, from healthcare, manufacturing, and really all over the country. We're hearing the same thing, is that folks can't find the talent that they need. And, you've got millions of people in this country who are here and ready to contribute and are truly already part of communities all over the country. And so in our view, pushing for common sense immigration solutions that allow folks to get to work is economically crucial. It's morally right, and it's politically smart. We've seen polling that show that really majorities of folks across the country support paths to earn legal status, paths to citizenship for farm workers, for TPS holders, for dreamers, for essential workers. So that's what we're about.
Great. Thank you for doing that. And we threw out a bunch of different things here, and I want to define these really quickly. So we have, and was mentioned, ag visas or H-2A visas. An H-2A visa holder is a temporary visa worker who will come here to the United States and work for 9 months at a time. Then you have the TPS, which Michael just mentioned, temporary protected status. Mm-hmm. And James and I were just talking about that a second ago. Actually, do you want to talk about that for just a quick second?
Sure. Temporary protected status, or TPS, is a designation given to certain countries by Congress. So it has to be approved by Congress for a specific event that's happening in that country. For example, civil unrest or natural disasters. And what it allows for people from that country to come to the United States, get a work permit, and stay temporarily in the United States until whatever event was happening in their country has concluded.
Okay, so we can agree that those folks, from a moral standpoint, I think most of us can agree that we should be giving them the ability to be here, to be protected while they're here, to be able to work while they're here. I already spoke to the H-2A visa holders that are coming on an annual basis to work and be part of the economy. And then you have DACA, or the Dreamers. And Enrique happens to be one of the Dreamers. And I'd like him to talk a little bit about his story, because what we're trying to talk about when we said common sense, or like the simple approaches where we can all agree. In politics, there's so many things that we can disagree on. I think there's way more common ground than we give ourselves credit for. At the same time, the politicians maybe don't, and they can keep us divided. But this is one of those places, especially behind Dreamers or DACA members, that we certainly should be able to agree on, just like the TPS. So, Enrique, can you tell us a little bit about your story, how you ended up working for ABIC, and how you got to where you are today?
For sure. Thank you again for having us. So in the spirit of defining the other terms, so DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And the term dreamer actually comes from the first piece of legislation that was introduced in the early 2000s by Orrin Hatch and Senator from Illinois, Dick Durbin. And so the term dreamer comes from the DREAM Act, which stands for, here, I actually had it up right here, for Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. And so that's kind of where the term was coined from, and it has been used for by people who are in my situation. So DACA came about in 2012 as immigration policy in the Obama administration. And for me, I've just been so lucky to really be in a timeline where the DACA passed, that I didn't really have to suffer through the things that a lot of my family members, friends who were older than me had to endure because of their immigration status.
What do they have to endure?
Yes. So a lot of that comes from, it's education. They didn't really have the same access in education that I was able to take a part of. The privilege to drive legally, the ability to work legally as well. So all of these are things that were better for my situation simply because of my age. And so I was born in Mexico when I was 2 years, and when I was 2 years old, my family immigrated to the United States. And so my father was actually a farm worker before I was even born. He started coming to the United States in 1995 when he as you mentioned, coming for several months at a time and then returning back home to be with his family. And unfortunately, while he was away working the fields, he missed my birth, and so he wasn't present for my birth. And then in the year 2000, he finally decided to move my family and I to a place where a lot of our family members were moving to. And so I had the opportunity to grow up in Utah and go through the educational system there, where in high school, a lot of...
I have to ask this. So not to cut you off, but when you talk about your dad decided to bring your family, that entailed more than just your dad deciding to bring your family. To speak to what you're comfortable to, right? So if you don't want to, whatever, right? But I mean, if we're going to have a candid conversation, so people understand, like, what does that mean, and what did your parents have to do to get yourself here and your mom, and how challenging was it, and what was the danger that they took upon themselves in order to try and come to a place where they could have a better opportunity and a better life?
Yeah. So it's a story that it's still, grainy for me. My earliest memory wasn't even until I was in preschool when I was 3 or 4 years old. So I don't even remember any of the actual process of coming to the United States. I was only 2 years old, but the stories that I have asked my mother about, it's really crazy because I know 2-year-olds who it would be very difficult to travel alone with. Let alone cross the border.
Very relatable.
So the story that my mom tells me, is that she had to pack several suckers for me to keep quiet when we needed to. And so I don't fully remember, if we had any walking to do it, what if we came through a car, and that's definitely a story that I know that I should know or ask about before, it's too late. But it's a little bit harder for my sister because my sister was 7 years old when we came across the border. So she does remember it. And her life story, you can definitely tell that she was older when we crossed that border because she started school in the 3rd grade in the middle of a school year. And so it shows in like her ability to speak English. She didn't have that same opportunity that I did going into preschool, learning English with all the other 3 or 4 year olds, learning some of those, basic words that we all use in our daily lives. And so it's really been like a learning experience, where I use my sister as a life lesson in a good way. There's a lot that my sister has done that I am very proud of her for. But she didn't have those same opportunities that I did. Like I mentioned earlier, she didn't have the ability to drive legally. She didn't have the ability to work legally at the age of 16 for her to be able to save to go to college like I did.
Even though she was 16. Right?
Exactly.
Even though she was 7, when she came here, right? It wasn't her decision.
Exactly. And so just like those 5 years alone, like really made a difference in my life. And there were lessons that I had the opportunity to learn from that I took into my life. But it's also just like, knowing that my parents left everything behind to come give us a better life. And unfortunately, like my parents, their plan was to come for a year and then go back to Mexico. That's exactly what my mom had told her mother. And my grandmother passed over the summer. And that was like one of the hardest things for her was to I told her I was going to be gone 1 year and then I never saw her again.
She could never go back, right? If she did, she could never come back to the States. And this is one of millions of stories where people have done the same thing and come to do something in a similar fashion to the way, at least I know my family were immigrants. Does anybody have family that weren't immigrants that came, right? Like we all have a similar story. And it's funny. We draw this line and we're like, okay, for certain people, it's okay. For other people, it's not. And I think that's where I get frustrated because the system, when I look at the system, okay, being very candid again, for decades, instead of having an appropriate process to cross our southern border and come into the United States that would meet the demands for labor in the United States. Okay, so there was a process. I don't want to say that you couldn't come to the United States legally for the last 20 years, but there was a significant period of time over decades where there was high demand for labor across all industries, certainly inclusive of agriculture. And people would cross to come take those jobs because there was demand for people to come and do those jobs. But there wasn't enough of an immigration process in place to allow that process to happen as orderly as it should. So what happens when people can't really come when they need to, and when when employers need people to come and there's jobs open, people figure out how to come. Both the employer needs them and the worker needs the work, and the numbers end up being what they are, and the immigration status of those people ends up being what it is. And that is not the fault of the people who came. It is the fault, in my opinion, of the process, the lack of having the system in place to accommodate those that needed to come to the United States, that were needed in the United States, that wanted to come to the United States to work and contribute and to better their lives, just like my family did when they came from Germany in the 1880s. It's not different. And it's for some reason we look at it differently. I don't know if anybody else, if I'm getting too political for you, you can I can see James over there. James, I can see his
You're doing great.
Yeah, no, I think it's just worth noting that, that demand for jobs still exists. It's a relatively open secret that, approximately half of all farm workers nationwide are undocumented. And then if you go into specific subsets within agriculture, that number goes even higher, depending on whether or not those subsets within agriculture have access to the H-2A program, or whether or not that program will be sufficient to meet their labor needs. Just try and imagine for 1 second if suddenly we got very serious about immigration enforcement, what would happen to agriculture? What would happen to if 50%
your food supply? No,
right.
let's just put it to your food supply.
Right, to the industry and also to the products that you get at the grocery store. What would happen to them if in one instant half of the entire workforce that picks your crops, milks your cows, processes and packs the meat, suddenly we're not here and we're not able to work?
Right. And the argument that I hear, then I'm going to get too political and I'm going to have people listening to the podcast that are upset with me about this too. But I think speaking the truth is really important. And if you follow me, you know that by now. The reality is lots of the times we get criticized or demonized for the fact that we have immigrant workers working in the field. And what are the working conditions like, or what is the pay like? The question that you have to ask yourself, and I don't want to pretend like working in the fields is easy, because it's not. Not for a second do I want to pretend like that. Do I want to tell you that it's the best pay? No. I will tell you that on our farming operation on the Oregon side, it's more than $17 an hour. Okay, for those workers to work in the field. We have a 3% retirement match. Which a lot of people don't know. So they're making $17 an hour. There's a 3% retirement match, and there's paid sick leave. The benefits are reasonable. They're not perfect. They could be better. At the same time, though, the alternative is to shift this production to say, okay, fine. To James' point, okay, we'll just make everything illegal. And the folks that are here that shouldn't be here, we stop food production in the United States and we say, okay, we have to source our food elsewhere. Well, where is that production most likely to go? It's most likely to go to Mexico. And the comparison there in working conditions, in pay, so we're talking 50 cents to $1.50 per hour in pay. There's very little to no regulation on the housing conditions, and the exposure to chemicals and whatnot. Just the overall regulation is dramatically different. And we have to say, okay, that's the decision that I'm making. I can say no more undocumented workers working in the field, or no more without appropriate documentation with those workers in the fields in the United States, and we'll just figure out, let the whatever fall. Thank you. Let the chips fall where they may, and it'll work itself out, and it would. But what are the human costs to those changes? And we're not trying to be unfair. We have never been tried to be unfair. Is it an imperfect system? Absolutely, it is. But we have to look at it. The nuances are critically important, though. It really does come down to the nuances of understanding the circumstances that people, how they've arrived to work where they do without documentation, if that's the case. And I think that's where I come from, this unique perspective. I mean, okay, so I'm in agriculture and that's one thing, but I also grew up in this town with, 3,000 people, half of which are Latinos, most of which are Mexicanos, right? Like they're all mostly from Mexico. My graduating class was half, Mexican descendants, or first or second generation, some third, but most first and second. And so I know people. And if you would just take the time to know and understand people, all of a sudden the nuances of everything matter. The details matter, and the need to come together and agree at least on the three things we're talking about here. Obviously, being a member of ABIC, I agree with what they're talking about. At least these dreamers, the DACA members, DACA recipients? Is that how I say that right? The DACA recipients. Enrique should be able to choose the career. He's got the education. He should be able to pick the career that he has trained for. You didn't mention that he wanted to be a police officer. So I'm filling the blanks in because I know the backstory there. He wanted to be a police officer. He can't because of because of his immigration status. Can we not agree that someone who has been here since they're 2, has worked their way through school, has gotten the education, has the skill set, and the job opening is there, that they should be able to fill that position? I would hope that we could. I think the same thing when we're talking about immigrant workers that have been working in agriculture for decades, that we need and that we really can't replace in any other way, should have a path to citizenship. And then when we talk about TPS, the temporary protective status, the same thing. Like, these folks came here, and what ends up happening with TPS generally is it never gets resolved, right? It just they extend it. So these folks have to speak to that for just a second.
Yeah, the TPS process is Congress has to every 10 years recertify a country for TPS status. For example, after the earthquake in Haiti is when Congress first extended TPS status to Haitians. So many of them came, started working, and started families. And at this point, it has now been 30 plus years that a lot of the Haitians have been here, and at this point have gotten married, had children, and because they had children here in the United States, those children are U.S. citizens, but now have to worry every 10 years when that deadline comes up whether or not Congress is going to recertify them and allow them to stay in the United States, or if they're going to have to leave.
Right, and the argument would be, okay, well, of course they're going to extend it. Of course they're going to do that. But how would you, as an individual, like to live with that uncertainty all the time, just looming back there, knowing that there is this potential, and crazier things have happened in the government where your kids could all be in the United States, have grown up in the United States, and off you go to Haiti, or off you go to Central America, or off you go to this other location because we can't finally make a decision around them.
Just to speak to that a little bit, and then something I want to go back to Enrique, if that's okay. But I mean, TPS holders that we work with, it's hard to plan for buying a home, for career plans, if you have to, worry about renewing your status every 2 years. So that affects human lives, and it also affects the economy. If people aren't doing those things, it's bad for the economy as a whole. It's pretty straightforward. And so, I mean, there really are two parts to this. There's just the straightforward labor shortage, and we have members, you have hospitals in Maine who have 500 open positions. We have restaurants in North Carolina that are cutting down their hours because they can't find the workers that they need. The construction sector in Arizona is out thousands of positions that they can't fill. And then there's the reality that, immigrants are part of our communities and are building communities all around the country. And I mean, Enrique, do you want to speak a little bit more to that whole process that Shay was referencing before around how do you decide you want to be a police officer? What that whole experience is like?
Exactly. And so that's something that, kind of began my activism, was noticing that a lot of people who I spoke to were shocked to find out that I was a DACA recipient. It's I've heard about them on the news, but I didn't know they were around me. And so that's kind of one of my biggest lines is we're your classmates, we're your coworkers, we're your neighbors. We are here already. And so to let all of this talent go to waste when we could use it to benefit all of our communities, it's really detrimental to our country and the economy. And so, so for me, when I was little, I had just great role models in the local police department where I grew up, where they really made an impact on my life. I mean, it started when we had a track meet at school, and my parents didn't have the money to buy me running shoes. And our police officer, who was in the office at the time, he was like, you know what, come with me, get into my car right now. We're going to Nike and we're getting you some running shoes. And so that to me, it really made a major difference in my life to be able to participate with my other classmates, that it inspired me to want to become a police officer. And so later in life, in high school, when we were doing college and career preparedness, that's kind of when I started looking into the process of becoming a police officer. And unfortunately, that's the number one thing that's listed is United States citizen. And so, there were several little pieces that led to me finding out about my undocumented status. But that was definitely kind of the nail in the coffin, I really can't do this because of this one thing. And so it's really, like you said, I went to school, I studied all about criminal justice. And I actually even worked for a police department who was kind enough to accept me in a position that I could, still work with law enforcement and learn the ways of law enforcement to, if anything changed nationally, I could immediately jump on board as a police officer. And unfortunately that just hasn't happened. And so last year, the state of Utah had a bill in the legislature, SB 102, that allowed non-citizens to become police officers in the state. And so I was able to testify in front of Senate committees. And this was all thanks to our chief of police and our leadership there at the police department that wanted me to do it, because they were in favor of us passing something so that people like me who want to do the job, who can represent our communities and know the language of our community members, become police officers. So I testified in front of committees, and fortunately that bill made its way to the governor's desk where it was signed. Unfortunately, some of the language inside the bill only allowed for that bill to go down to green card holders. So anything below a green card holder, such as me, a DACA recipient, weren't allowed to take advantage of that bill. So while several people who didn't have the opportunity to do it before now do, I think that it's a step in the right direction. And it's a type of a bipartisanship that we need, again, just to show people that we are here, we are all around you, and we contribute to this community.
Yeah, I think Enrique's story speaks to a huge waste of opportunity and a huge waste of talent that the current immigration system forces us into. Enrique is incredibly intelligent. He's incredibly driven, and would do a phenomenal job as a police officer, I have no doubt. But because of a decision that was made a long time ago, he's not able to do that. Our executive director at ABIC, when she came to the United States, her mother was a doctor in her home country, and worked in restaurants when she got to the United States. I think that it's just to put it bluntly, it's a pretty common theme that immigrants come to the United States to do jobs that Americans cannot do, don't have the qualifications or the expertise or knowledge to do, or jobs that Americans would never do. It's difficult to find busboys at restaurants. It's difficult to find people who are willing to do the work of picking asparagus or picking onions at your farm. And that's because U.S. citizens who, by nature of their birth and by happenstance of where they were born, are able to do that without fear. They don't want to do that job. And so we waste talent every day when there are people who are ready, willing, and able to work, but cannot because of their status. And we waste opportunities for them to become homeowners one day, which is good for all of us, good for the economy. We lose the opportunity for them to send their children to college, which is good. It's never a bad thing to have a more educated populace. So we're wasting opportunity and we're wasting talent.
Thanks, Jameson and Enrique. Thanks for being willing to stand up and stand out. That can't be an easy thing to do. And that I think that, to his point, to what Enrique was saying, we're out there, as he was saying, there's dreamers out there. There's people that you wouldn't think would be in the circumstance that are, and we need to be as compassionate as we can and as understanding as we can of the entire process. And again, of the nuances and of the decisions that force people to do or to make the decisions that they did. And if we can do that from a humanitarian standpoint, just from a moral standpoint, we need to get on the same page on the things that we can agree on, which is not going to be everything, but strive to be on the same page. And when you have an opportunity to speak up and speak out and to share your perspective and your understanding, I think you should do that. If I could encourage everyone, and even the critics here that are going to listen to what this conversation has been and who are going to disagree, I think that's fine. Disagree, but understand the perspective of others at the very, very least, so that when there is a place where you can agree, you can raise your hand and say, hey, I get that. I understand that person. I understand the circumstance. I understand why they made that decision and how I would have or could have made that same decision if I was placed in that position in my life at that same point, whether I was going to put food on the table for myself and my family, or whether I was going to, stay in my current circumstances and wonder whether I could put a meal on the table the very next day. Thanks again for thanks for my guests. Thanks guys for coming in. They drove over. Well, not everyone's from Chicago, right? In fact, Two of you.
us
Okay,
are.
there's two people from Chicago. Enrique's from Park City. He's cool. The Chicago guys, you know, we're going to forgive them for being from Chicago for today. In the spirit of kindness, right? That's what we were just talking about. But we were glad to have them here. If you liked what you heard, like and subscribe, follow along. If you didn't like what you heard, hey, heck, give it a thumbs down, but give me a comment at least if there's something that I can address and answer. That's what I'm here for, to the extent of my ability. Again, my circumstance, the small town in which I grew up, surrounded by phenomenal Latin folks, really formed my opinion of them and of their contribution and my understanding of what they mean to me personally and what they mean to my community and what they mean to our economy and to our business. And just do me that favor. I'll see you guys later. Thank you.